With Path of Exile 2 just on the horizon, I thought now would be as good a time as any to make a critique-style review of Path of Exile 1. I've played Path of Exile pretty casually for 3 or 4 leagues now, starting I think with 3.0 the Fall of Oriath, and really getting into it in the 3.23 Affliction and 3.25 Settlers of Kalgur leagues. I've cleared all maps twice now, and I've beaten some tier 17 maps and pinnacle bosses, but I tend to fall off the game before I get to uber pinnacle bosses. For those who've never played Path of Exile, a league is kind of like the equivalent of a season in a traditional live service game where some core mechanics get added or changed to add more variety to the experience. Leagues are separated into their own mode, and at the end of every league, the characters and items created in it get transferred into the standard realm. When I began playing, I created my first character on the standard realm because it sounded like it offered the most standard game experience, but I'd honestly just recommend new players create a character in the current league since they'll get ported over into standard eventually anyway. In addition to the standard and league experiences, players can also choose to play a solo, self-found character who can't trade or party with other players, or they can also choose to play on hardcore mode where characters get transferred to non-hardcore realms upon dying. There's also Ruthless mode, which lives up to its name by drastically reducing the drop rates of items and changing some mechanics to make the game much more difficult than the usual experience. Once you decide what game mode you want to play, you'll be taken to the character select screen, which can have a large impact on your experience. Unfortunately, without following a guide, it's kind of impossible to understand exactly how this will affect you later on, and this kind of knowledge check will be kind of a recurring theme in Path of Exile. Quite often, it can retroactively feel like you're being punished for making the wrong decision that you didn't even know you were making. And while you can always go back and reset your character, this can come at a sizable resource cost, and so many people just opt out to reroll a new character entirely. I know they just recently added golds into the game, which can also be used to respec your skill points, but it's difficult to say how viable that is right now in the Settlers of Kalgur League, since most will probably be funneling their gold into the town anyway. Nonetheless, even if you make mistakes with your first character, there can still be a lot of value gained from the meta-knowledge of these mistakes, and the more knowledge you have about the game, the more you can leverage it for success in the future. As such, it may be better to think of your first character as a trial character that's meant to help you understand the basics of the game. So even though your starting class can vastly change how your build feels later on, there's still a ton of flexibility built into Path of Exile that can allow you to play the game basically however you want, and it's entirely possible to create a successful build you enjoy with your first character. Long story short, just pick a class that interests you and figure it out from there. Progression during Path of Exile's campaign feels really nice, as it does a good job of incrementally building up your basic nobody of a character into a literal godslayer without being too punishing, and I really like how substantial each upgrade feels when leveling up. While the lore is rich, and I really enjoy the dark fantasy setting and the story of the first 5 acts, it kind of falls off for me in Act 6, but remains serviceable as a vehicle to get me toward the endgame. For longtime players of Path of Exile, the campaign can feel like a bit of a slog though, particularly if you're just interested in getting back to the endgame, since you need to play through the entire campaign on each character, which can feel a bit tedious and time-consuming. I know they said they wanted to add more variety to the way the campaign is approached in Path of Exile 2, with story beats even changing between leagues, but for now, the more you play, the more tedious it can become unless you're really interested in benchmarking your current campaign progress against your previous runs. As for the combat and general gameplay for Path of Exile, I'm gonna keep it real with you. It's pretty clunky, especially melee combat, and the easiest way to exemplify that is by starting up a new character and showing how awkward it is trying to melee some crabs on the beach of Karuri Shores while they slowly scuttle away from you. I've always wanted a better way to control my character since the first moment I played, so I'm really excited for the introduction of WASD movement in Path of Exile 2. With that being said, a lot of the clunkiness of Path of Exile 1 gets reduced the more you level and improve your build, but I still don't particularly enjoy the song and dance of stutter stepping around enemies as I cast skills and spells at them. Nonetheless, there's so many different varieties of builds and combinations of spells and skills to try and discover in Path of Exile that I can overlook a lot of the shortcomings of the moment-to-moment combat for the sheer fun of finding combinations of skills I like. One of the most daunting parts of Path of Exile is opening up the skill tree for the first time. In many ways, it's similar to the sphere grid system of Final Fantasy X, where you gain points as you level up to allocate to different passive skills, and your class determines your starting position. While it can be intimidating to see how many options are available to you all at once, more realistically, you only have to decide between a few options at a time until you advance further into the game. This makes it pretty easy to go through the game piece by piece, but I must admit things do get a lot more complicated when you get toward the endgame and need to start effectively balancing your defenses with your offensive stats and begin incorporating things like jewels into your build. I like to say that the skill tree isn't that complex, because in many ways it's really not, but the whole is greater than the sum of its parts in Path of Exile, and a lot of the challenge in planning your build comes from managing your equipment as well as having the proper game knowledge and knowing what you can budget into your build and when to do it. For instance, there are certain items which can drastically alter the way you interact with the skill tree, like timeless jewels, but there's virtually no way for new players to know about this kind of thing unless they're following a guide or doing their own research. I always think it's a bit of a flaw if a game forces the player to stop playing the game to look up information about it, and one of my biggest grievances with Path of Exile is how unclear many of its systems are. To start off with some small examples, while I like the idea of vendor recipes, that is, certain combinations of items that can be given to shopkeepers for specific rewards, I don't think these vendor recipes are communicated to the player very well. Beyond that, certain mechanics like betrayal are nigh impossible to understand on your own without looking up a guide, and certain kinds of game knowledge can have a big impact on your bottom line. One example of this is that your equipment has sockets which can have skill gems or support gems slotted into them, kind of like materia in Final Fantasy VII. You can recolor the sockets on a piece of equipment if you use a chromatic orb, but you're more likely to get sockets that match the color of the stats of the equipment, so red is strength, blue is intelligence, etc. If you're trying to get an uncommon socket color onto a piece of equipment, it can become a pretty sizable investment depending on what you're going for. One way to sort of circumvent this system is by taking your equipment to the crafting bench and reforging one socket at a time until you get the colors you want, since this process doesn't overwrite the original sockets unlike chromatic orbs. It's incredibly smart and pragmatic that some players figured this out, but you're still kind of out of luck if you need to off-color 5 or 6 sockets on a bigger item. I really dislike this system since it's tedious and you're at the mercy of RNG, or it's really expensive for something which feels like it should be a negligible investment. I'd rather be able to recolor one socket at a time, so I was overjoyed to hear the socket coloring system is going away in Path of Exile 2. Going back to how some systems are unclear, if you have a skill gem like Summon Raging Spirit, which is tagged as being a spell as well as a fire and minion skill, one might assume nodes in the passive skill tree which increase spell damage or fire damage would affect Summon Raging Spirits. They don't. Only things which explicitly say they modify minion damage will affect it. Well, sort of. If you have a node which lets you cast spells faster, you can summon them more quickly, so it's woefully inconsistent knowing what affects what sometimes. While the system does make sense once you understand how it actually works, it's really unintuitive and can easily lead people down the wrong route. I know they said they wanted to address these kinds of problems in Path of Exile 2, and I've got my fingers crossed, but I'm still apprehensive to see how it's going to turn out. And while the problem of understanding minion damage is pretty niche, I must admit it took me an embarrassingly long time to realize that equipment provided local bonuses to stats rather than global ones. Some of the time. What I mean by this is that if you have a shield with 100 armor and has a mod which says 100% increased armor, it's saying the shield has 100% increased armor, not you, and if this mod were removed, the shield would go back down to 50 armor rather than halving your armor rating. I might be wrong on that, so if anyone has a better example they want to share in the comments, by all means feel free. Part of why this is unintuitive is because equipment also provides global defenses for things like health and elemental resistances, so you really need to pay attention to how your defensive layers stack on top of each other. Speaking of which, one of the things I failed to notice or appreciate out of my first playthrough of the game was how the player's elemental resistances get lowered at different breakthroughs of the campaign. At the end of the campaign, all of your resistances will be permanently lowered by 60%. I really dislike this system because it feels like an arbitrary increase in difficulty, and I'd rather have just been taking the full damage from enemy hits so I could plan accordingly, rather than being blindsided by something so permanent. This is only true for a first playthrough though, but I highly doubt there's players out there who are legitimately excited for the characters to get kneecapped this way the first time they were playing. This stuff doesn't matter too much if you're just checking out the campaign, but the further you progress toward the endgame, the more important your defenses become, to the point it feels like most of my build crafting becomes concerned with patching up holes in my defensive layers. Now, don't get me wrong, I definitely think it's important that defenses have value, but it can be a little fatiguing making sure you've got sufficient layers for physical damage, elemental damages, chaos damage, direct hits, damage over time, debuffs like poison, ignite, bleed, freeze, shock, and corrupted blood, and so on and so forth. Even so, with the way that modifiers stack onto monsters in the endgame, it feels way too easy to get one-shot by something without fully understanding why. And this is where I tend to fall off Path of Exile pretty hard. Once you clear the campaign, you gain access to items called maps, which allow you to explore temporary zones with monsters and bosses inside. Maps come in 16 basic tiers, with 1 being the lowest and 16 being the highest, and tier 17 maps are special grade items that are meant to bridge the gap between pinnacle content and uber pinnacle content. Maps can be directly modified to increase the difficulty and reward of enemies inside, and they can be further modified by clearing maps and allocating passive points to your Atlas skill tree. The Atlas skill tree is similar to the player's skill tree, only instead of modifying the player's stats, they alter the modifiers present on your maps. This can be used to tailor your maps for specific content, so if you like the tower defense mode of Blight, the Thunderdome-like nature of Ritual, or the way monsters constantly spawn out of the map from Delirium, can guarantee that these events appear in any given map. It's a really great way to tailor the endgame experience to the player's liking, but there's some oddities to the system that I still don't fully understand. For instance, to get the most out of maps, you need to have a build that's capable of clearing them, which is perfectly fine. In addition to that, there are also certain challenges which allow the player to gain void stones and map device slots that can be used to further empower their maps. Now, a lot of this makes sense, don't get me wrong, but if you don't have a build that's capable of clearing this kind of content, you kind of get stuck in a catch-22 of being unable to make any progress while mapping. So how do you get better at clearing maps? By gathering currency to improve your build. How do you get currency to improve your build? By clearing maps. Obviously this is a bit reductive, but if you have a suboptimal build, you won't have access to all the tools like Atlas skill points, void stones, and map device fragments that would allow you to effectively farm for currency. Don't get me wrong, you still can farm for currency, but you're just going to be much less effective than someone else who knows what they're doing, and take much longer to do it as a result. Of course, some players sell services to help others complete these challenges, and other players will help out for free, but after the smoothness of the campaign, the mapping system just feels really imbalanced to me, and it's designed in such a way where the rich will continue to get richer by virtue of having the best understanding of the economy and the systems underlying the game. While I really like the idea of having to complete all of the maps to fill out the Atlas passive skill tree on paper, in practice, I find it to be really tedious, and I don't enjoy having to hunt down and complete specific maps I'm missing before I feel like I can do the content I want to do. Now, part of this is a me issue, but one problem I've run into while mapping is this constant uncertainty of whether or not I should be using my scarabs to increase my map rewards while I'm still clearing them, or if it's better to hang on to my resources until my Atlas tree is more complete so I can better min-max my results later. This is currently the part of the game that I feel like I understand the least, and if I play another league, I think I'll have to spend a decent chunk of time trying to better understand mapping and the endgame economy now that I've got a better understanding of the extra content like Blight, Delirium, Ritual, and Betrayal. Even so, a big part of me is apprehensive about following farming guides, because I've seen how easily people can get priced out of running certain strategies if it becomes the meta pick. I really like the idea of having aspirational content to look forward to like the uber pinnacle bosses, and it's definitely been something that's kept me coming back, so I don't know how good of an idea it would be to make it easier for players to reach that content. I realize not all builds can make it to the endgame, and there are even certain strategies employed by players where they make a starter build to farm enough currency to use for a completely different endgame character, but it's always been difficult for me to stay locked into one character long enough to get enough currency to take my build to the next level on my own. The way that I rate games is on a bell curve, with a 5 being an average, fun, and enjoyable game. 6s and above are reserved for games that stand a cut progressively above the rest, and 4s and below are for games that are flawed or actively predatory towards the player. Another way to look at it would be that for me, A 5 is kind of like a guilty pleasure. A game like Dynasty Warriors that isn't particularly fantastic, but I enjoy it nonetheless and wouldn't go around recommending it to people unprompted unless I knew they were into those kind of games. With this in mind, I'm going to do something a bit unorthodox for the channel and give Path of Exile a few different ratings. If you're the type of player that just wants to go in and not be held back by your knowledge of a game's systems and mechanics, I'd give Path of Exile a 4 out of 10. Not because it's bad or anything, but just because I don't think such a player would be interested in it. For casual gamers who don't mind looking up things from time to time, I'd give Path of Exile a 6 out of 10 because it's pretty good despite its jankiness, and for players who really enjoy delving into complex game systems, I'd give Path of Exile an 8 out of 10. It's really easy to get lost in the theory and build crafting Path of Exile has to offer, and you can spend entire days enjoying the game without even being logged in. I know I've been pretty harsh in this review, but I want to emphasize that I actually really do like Path of Exile despite my complaints, and I've been so impressed with the responses given by the developers in their interviews for Path of Exile 2 that it's made me want to support Grinding Gear Games by purchasing some of their supporter packs. I've spent hundreds of hours in the game already, making it well worth the money spent, and the team's open, thoughtful responsiveness to the community heading into Path of Exile 2 is something I want to see more of in the gaming community. If you guys haven't had the chance to check out Path of Exile 2 or any of its dev interviews, I'd highly recommend watching something like Josh Strife Hayes' interview with the lead game designer Jonathan Rogers, since he does a good job of posing questions from a new player's point of view. It took me a lot longer to make this review than I expected, partly because I was being stubborn and wanted to beat the Uber bosses first, but then I kind of ran out of steam. I still had a lot of fun playing the season though, and while it's been easier than ever to passively get currency with the shipping mechanic, I decided to ignore it in the scope of this review since there's no guarantee it'll go core in the future. If you're a longtime player of Path of Exile, do me a favor and let me know what you think of the review. Do you have some of the same issues, particularly when it comes to mapping? Or have you gotten beyond that point? What helped you climb over the wall? For people new to Path of Exile or who've never played before, what do you think? Are you interested in either Path of Exile 1 or 2? If so, why or why not? Anyway, that'll be it from me. I hope you found this review either insightful or enjoyable, and thanks for watching. Feel free to like, comment, or subscribe. I'd also like to take a moment to give a special shout out to my channel members and patrons for continuing to support the channel even during content lulls where I'm spending months trying to figure out other games like this one. Until next time, take care, stay safe. Last Protagonist out.